Hey everyone, and welcome to the podcast Too Much Disinformation, the pod that uncovers the good, the bad, and the fake of the online world. I'm your host, Rafi Mendelsohn, and on today's pod, we're going to be discovering and discussing a big topic that everyone's talking about: AI, machine learning, ChatGPT. But we're going to be coming at it from a slightly different angle and discussing some of the things that you may not have heard so far, because we're really going to be covering a lot about the opportunities as well as some of the threats to the OSINT world. On today's pod, we have Matt Edmondson. Really excited to have Matt on. Spoken to him a few times, always loved our conversations. Matt is a hacker by nature who spent 21 years at the US Department of Homeland Security. He trained thousands of people across the Department of Defense, Department of Justice, and the Department of Homeland Security on topics including OSINT and cybersecurity. Matt is the principal instructor for the open source intelligence course at the SANS Institute, and he also spends his time nowadays as the founder of Argelius Labs. Without further ado, we're going to start the show. Hey Matt, how you doing?
Good, fantastic, Rafi. Thanks for having me here. How are you doing?
It's our pleasure. It's our pleasure. I've been looking forward to this conversation and been following your stuff for a while. Really good to have you on the show. What we normally do is we kick off by asking people what their first social media platform was. Care to fill in the listeners and let them know?
I could go real old school and say it was like the old bulletin board systems back in the day when I was a super little kid with my, dial-up modem. But no, I had like a MySpace and stuff like that. I think the first platform that I ever really used though, because usually it was like even like my MySpace and Facebook, like, people I was dating would make them for me. I never really used them. I think the first one I actually used myself was Twitter, just because I found it so valuable as as basically a news stream.
Hmm.
Right. There's so many areas like an offensive security, other things where there's so much going on. It's tough to really keep abreast of what's new and what's current and what's changing, but you can follow like maybe 30, 40 select people and see that, right? Just kind of realize, okay, if this is important, I'm going to see it from one of them. So I think Twitter was probably not the first one that I used, but the first one that I really embraced.
Amazing. And are you still active day to day on Twitter?
Yeah, I'm more active than ever before. I used to mostly with Twitter just be a lurker. Right. Most of the things, if I would retweet or whatever, was just like little dumb conversations with friends of mine around sports or, just kind of like, retweeting something that a friend was doing. Now I'm actually trying to put more out there and get a little bit more active. And that's one thing too of, for the past 2 decades, like I've done so much, I've written so many tools and done all these things, but I usually didn't talk about much of it publicly, right?
Mm.
Because I was doing it for the government. And so now it's been this transition. And to some people, they may think like, oh, yeah, we're seeing all this stuff that we haven't seen before. And I have a little bit more freedom now to, to do the things that I'm doing and talk about them. So it's nice.
Nice, nice. And I suppose what you haven't said, which people will be interested to know, is that you pretty much wrote the book on OSINT, right? And you've been
Or
given training. So
Yeah, so I years ago I developed an OSINT course for the government, like very very early on, and they have taught me all over, not only teaching our own personnel here in the United States, but like I've been to Europol, been to German Federal Police to teach over there outside Berlin. So I've done all of that, and then I've been a SANS instructor, teaching usually more technical, for lack of a better term, topics, things on like pen testing or digital forensics, that. And then in last year, kind of, there was an opportunity where basically they asked me if I was interested in writing an OSINT course for SANS, and it's like, shoot. So in a lot of ways, it's the OSINT course that I always wanted to write, because I
mm,
get to go a lot more in depth on things. We have the virtual machine, so we can set up like all these labs, and all the labs in the course are based on things that have happened in the real world. So yeah, it was a blast to kind of set that up and do it. It's still very early on in the process, but the feedback has been just basically perfect. And so, like I said, it's nice because in a lot of ways, it's the class that I would have liked to write in the government, but really couldn't for numerous issues, frankly.
and who are you, especially for the SANS course? Who are you delivering this to?
It's all over the place. It really, really is. And I know that's such a horrible answer, but everyone is using OSINT now, right? And I think
Mm,
for years, like people wanted the skills for OSINT, but they weren't necessarily using the word OSINT. And now I think just everyone knows it. And it's like all throughout the industry, right? You think like, oh, it's going to be government. It's going to be people in this field. It's going to be people in that field. Like I've had several, it's kind of funny. I've had a lot of people from video game companies even who are basically like
oh, wow.
researching people like who are trying to cheat in video games or developing the cheats and certain things like that, or just cyber threat, CTI people from all these different places all over. So yeah, it's been kind of wild. It's people talking to those sitting, it's fascinating. And one thing that I've talked about before is OSINT is really, in a lot of ways, kind of converging, right? If you think like, oh, well, I'm a private investigator. This is how I use OSINT. Oh, I'm law enforcement. This is how I use it. Oh, I'm, CTI for a Fortune 100 company. This is how I use it. Those are looking more and more similar now, right?
Mm,
Everyone's kind of missions, So even like people that are private sector, not law enforcement, well, shoot, now they're like researching threats against executives. They're trying
mm,
to deal with maybe certain protests or certain things like that, things that historically would have almost been a law enforcement style of mission, right? And vice versa. Law enforcement now is like tracking down an IP address, trying to figure out if this is someone using a VPN or not. And yeah, everything's getting kind of jumbled together. So it's interesting to see. I'm very fortunate in that I have my experience like the government and law enforcement side, but
mhm.
my wife actually ran cyber threat intelligence for a Fortune 100 and has a lot of experience and is still in that space too. And so it's kind of bouncing, talking through problems together. It gives me a good perspective to be fairly well rounded in the problems that people are running into and working with them to figure out solutions to that. So
So the dinner table conversation around the Edmondson household must be full of threats and risks and TTPs and
yes, yes, that is factually correct.
amazing. And I'm sure a lot has changed, and you've already kind of alluded to all the changes, and also the different kinds of people who are now coming from different spaces because of the changing use cases or the techniques that were previously possibly applied to one types of people, but now are actually being applied in different lots of different applications. What stayed the same in the world of OSINT? What has been the unifying kind of thing that hasn't changed?
What has been the unifying thing that kind of hasn't changed in OSINT? That's a good question. Google, right? Google's still Google, but now all of a sudden, right, we're seeing maybe for years, Facebook had a really good day from a stock perspective yesterday. But for years, you've seen the path to Facebook eroding, right? They have a huge, huge war chest of money, but they've had some slippage with younger people as they were going towards Instagram and then Snapchat and now TikTok, right? But for years, like Google just looked like this 800-pound gorilla that it was very
Mm,
tough to picture how or why like the slippage was going to start. Eventually everything slips. And now I think through the chat GPT, some of the AI ML, you've kind of seen like, wow, there's a way now, right? It's kind of weird in that you see these companies in some cases rushing out these products because they feel like they have to. Otherwise, there's this perception that they're getting left behind, frankly, in the space. And so, yeah, that's I think like kind of, the change in that, what stayed the same. I think just the general, how a lot of people use social media is still saying the same, right? For Facebook has a problem getting young people necessarily or keeping those, but the adults that Facebook has, like they have.
mhm.
Right. And I'm sure you do it, not maybe you don't do it, but you have friends that do it. I have a friend that'll just be sitting there constantly on their phone, getting happy, getting sad, getting angry, getting all these emotions just sitting there scrolling through, Facebook or other social media. So I think even as these, like one thing goes down, TikTok emerges as these types of things kind of shift, just the general of how people are using them, I think is kind of generally stayed the same. It's just a matter of what they're using.
Mhm. And one thing that really has changed, and the conversation that you seem to see everywhere, And a lot of people have a lot of takes on it, which is why it was so interesting to be able to bring this conversation here, is artificial intelligence and machine learning, but specifically when it's applied to OSINT. We're seeing a lot of stuff about threats. We discuss it internally all the time about whether this is going to be a catalyst at increasing dis and misinformation. And you have an interesting perspective on this.
Yeah, I think it's going to do both, right? It's one of those things like, is it going to make it better? Is it going to make it worse? Like, yes, right.
Right.
It really, really, truly is. And I remember like, because I mean, shoot, it was only talking about what, 6 months ago when you first started hearing people like, oh, hey, there's this chat GPT thing out there. It's really cool. And look, it wrote a poem about my dog, or, look, it did this. And it's like, all right, that's, kind of interesting, but it was like a novelty.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you start to play with it and really kind of test the capabilities, you really realize like, whoa, this is no novelty. Like this is absolutely ridiculous as a game changer, right? In so many different ways. And it's funny you bring up the kind of the misinformation because on one hand, I think it's going to give us unparalleled capabilities to analyze massive sets of data and find these patterns and perhaps, better identify what's going on. I think look at sentiment, for example. Sentiment has been an absolute dumpster fire forever, right? It really, really has been because it's like sarcasm,
Mm.
language changes, like all of these, like, if someone listens to this and they go like, oh, Rafi, I heard that podcast. That was bad. You killed it. Is that positive? Is that negative? Is that,
Yeah.
that's why just like sentiment has always struggled. And I remember we, at SANS, they have an artificial intelligence machine learning class. It's written by a guy named Dave Holzer, who's one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. And I do not say that lightly. And I remember shooting him a message. This is a year ago, probably before ChatGPT and everything came out. And I said, do you think like that this, like, kind of AI, do you think it's going to help with detection of sentiment analysis? And he's like, oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Like there was no like kind of hedging his bets or I think it's going to make progress or that. He's like, this is easy. It's made to order for it.
Mm.
And so, sure enough, sentiment analysis, that like standard traditional techniques that we incorporate into our tools, yeah, really, really kind of not impressive results. But now you ask ChatGPT or Google Bard to do that same sentiment analysis, and it's crushing it, right? It's doing so much better. So even that one little isolated thing, like I said, I think it's going to give us unparalleled capabilities to analyze data and kind of identify certain things. But on the flip side, it's also going to make it so much easier to set these networks up.
Mm.
Right. When I'm sitting there and I've done it, and, I had just a buddy of mine, it was funny, messaged me yesterday morning saying he'd just done a similar thing, but basically going to Chat GPT, hey, I need 10 names for people that, live in this region or this approximate age. All right, now flesh out profiles for them. What are some good connections to make? Like all of these things, and basically making a lot of this just kind of like push button click to
Mm.
generate these backstories and everything else and these profiles. And it's, like I said, it's going to make things easier to do. And it's also going to make things easier to detect, right? Like everything, it's going to be a cat and mouse game. And it's going to come up to kind of how we're using the technology, right? Just more than ever, it's going to be understanding how things work and getting very, very creative and clever with using
Mm-hmm.
what's available, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
one of these things. Like I see people trying to run away from Chat GPT. It's like, no, you should be embracing this because other
Mm-hmm.
people are, right? This is an important thing to kind of get comfortable with and familiar with, because using it wisely is going to be just, I think, unbelievably important from here going forward.
So let's get into the specifics then, and we're going to come to the challenges nearer the end. Those threats, because I think that's mostly of what you see people commenting on and talking about in
Yeah.
terms of the threats. Is this a bad thing? But you have some really interesting thoughts on the opportunities there. But let's try and get quite specific. If
Sure.
you're an OSINT analyst today, if you're sitting on your course now, what are some of the specific opportunities? Or you're sitting there trying to read as many articles, or your buddies are
Yeah.
sending you links of stuff, and there's so much to digest and lots of takes. If you're an OSINT analyst, what are the specific opportunities? What are the things that they should be thinking about when it comes to these new technologies?
Absolutely. That's always a difficult thing to speak of because so many people are doing different things in OSINT, right? Like OSINT to this person may not look like necessarily OSINT to that person. But recently, Google came out with kind of their answer to ChatGPT, Google Bard, right?
Mhm.
And all I heard was like when it first came out, this is a couple weeks ago, was Google Bard's like not nearly as good as ChatGPT, like it's just not impressive, not impressive. But the thing is, it has internet access, right? It's not going 2 years behind like ChatGPT is, kind of out of the box. And so I went to Google Bard and I said, tell me what are the top five, biggest news stories in Brazil this week? And it gave me those top five. And I'm like, summarize this into a paragraph, right? And I think summarizing is right now the most underrated feature of ChatGPT, being able to summarize large bodies of text and like give me a paragraph on it, give me two paragraphs on it, right? So being able to quickly see what's coming out of a region, being able to summarize that, being able to one of the when I did this for Brazil, one of the top news stories was the head of Brazil, like their prime minister, got sick, and so he had to postpone a trip to China. And I'm like, huh, interesting. I said, hey, I asked ChatGPT, I'm like, write me basically a 3-page argument of why Brazil and China's relationship is a threat to the United States, and it did it, and I read it, and it was good. Like it actually was solid, and I'm like, and then I said, write me a 3-page argument on why the relationship is not a threat to the United States. And it
Mm.
did it, and it was good. And so all of a sudden you start thinking about like an all source analyst who's responsible for monitoring what's going on in this region, to be able to have like seriously push button to where it can go out and analyze these sources and now provide you summaries of what you're seeing. It doesn't mean you don't have to go dig deeper, right? But just kind of like that summary. And I think back to, in my time with the government, I founded 3 units, technically 4, right? Technically 4 units. And all of those units were started as a 1-person shop.
Mhm.
Every one of those units is still going strong and they all have large teams. I look at that as a great point of pride. But I remember the first time I started up a unit, like a 1-person shop, there were certain things that my computer would do every day that would take a few hours to run. And so I would have my computer, it was set up to automatically like log in at 4 a.m. and start banging off all of these chores. And so then when I came in at like 6:37ish, I could sit down and just review the results and just
Mhm.
kind of like, okay, now I can push send on that. And I'm 2 hours ahead, right? Automation was the only chance I had to survive basically and just kind of keep up with the progress. And so, like I said, I start thinking all of a sudden, like I go straight to automation with a lot of this stuff. And you start automating, like looking at this data set, looking at this. Another example was the Conti, the ransomware family.
Mhm.
They had a bunch of their, when the Russia versus Ukraine situation broke out, a lot of their chat logs got leaked by people that were pro Ukraine. And so people were like, oh man, there's like 30,000 chat logs. This sounds great. Well, it's in JSON, not text, which for some people, they're like, I don't care. Some other people, it's slightly annoying to read. It's in Russian, right? I don't speak Russian, so I have to use translate everything. And so you start thinking about translating everything.
Mm.
There's ways to do it, but I can just take a chunk of those, paste it into Chat GPT and say, what are these people talking about?
Mhm.
And it sits there like, oh, this user is talking to this user about this. This user asked this user for this, and they gave them this link. That's amazing,
Mm.
right? That's absolutely amazing. And so as we start to, we're already seeing this where we have that capability locally running on our system, right?
Mhm.
Some of these capabilities more and more now are able to run offline, like OpenAI's Whisper for transcription is ridiculous, and you can run it offline. And so and all of a sudden, like OPSEC is a little bit less of a worry, right? If we can start doing some of this analysis offline and kind of automating that, I just think through like, once again, the massive amounts of data. And that's, obviously some people are very concerned about jobs with this type of technology, right? If I
Mhm.
was an artist right now, frankly, I would be terrified. I have no artistic ability. Even when I was a little kid, I tried to draw. It was horrible. I can't draw a straight line with a ruler. But now I can sit there with like Mid Journey, right, or
Yeah.
Dali, and just create these amazing pieces of art with text prompts. Like that's kind of crazy. And like I said, just thinking about what it's going to be doing, the massive amounts of data we're going to be analyzing and looking for patterns, and it's really going to the point of automation isn't to get rid of people, it's to free people up to do the work that they want to do and to focus on the things that you need humans. You do. We have that
Mhm.
certain creativity. We have these things, and it's just going to help people focus on that and get rid of all the mundane stuff that gets up to the point of where we're actually providing analysis, right? It's just making it easier to get to that point. So, like I said, I think, getting good with this technology and learning how to harness it is just, it's going to be critical from here going forward, because clearly this is not going away.
Interesting. And I've never thought about that. If you take OSINT analysts, the developments in technology allows you to do the OSINT bit. I know that sounds simplistic, but it then frees you up to do more of the analysis, which is the
Yep.
human part. So you don't think it's going to have an impact on the number of people that are going to be needed to be able to do it. Actually, it's going to allow us to be able to do more.
And I think there will be, I have no doubt that some people, unfortunately, it's going to make some jobs kind of go away. It's funny, is the only language I ever program anymore is Python. And the first time I ever wrote a Python program it was actually back when I was kind of doing stats and analysis, a lot of that with the government. And one of my analysts was using this GIS software called ArcGIS that you use to actually make maps and do analysis. And every week, she was responsible for producing a report of certain events that would happen in different regions of our area of operations. And that literally took her all day. So
Mm.
every week, one of her days, 20% of her week was spent doing that report. And so I'm like, And so I'm like, okay, well, what if I write Python to kind of tap in and take advantage of this? And it took me about 2 days to write. But then at the end of that, like the report was literally push button. She could put in the date
Mm.
range, push the button, and about 15 minutes later would spit out the report, everything done. I was her favorite person for months. Right. I view that as the point of the analysis. It wasn't like all of a sudden she wasn't doing anything that day. Now she was freed up to actually use what she was good at, right? The unique things that only she could bring to the table, her experiences, her
Mhm.
input, because she didn't have to worry about all this mundane BS and generating this report every week. And so I
Mm.
think of that as the potential, right, for how we can use this and use it properly.
So we've got summarizing, automating a lot of the activities, translating, being able to synthesize massive amounts of data
Yep.
to be able to draw conclusions from it. Sounds like huge opportunities that people should be thinking about. What are some of the challenges?
Some of the challenges right now in the space are fairly obvious. You know how it's one of those things like you can't say, well, that was obvious. Like everything's obvious in hindsight, right? Some of the things I think right now, or we're seeing, and I'll be specific to Chat GPT here, but frankly, we're seeing their answers get more and more kind of restricted,
Hmm.
right? And there's always been some restricted answers, right? If you ask it like, hey, how do I get rid of a body? Right? How do I hotwire a car? Right? It's always tried to like cut off that things that are clearly illegal. And people figure out like ways around it and asking super, little gambits and stuff and ways to kind of what they refer to as jailbreaking to get those, kind of unfiltered responses. But those have been filtered and that made sense out of the box. What we're seeing more and more now, and I hate this trend and I really hope it reverses, but I understand why it's happening, is we're seeing more filtered responses in realms of getting answers that you would normally get from a professional who is licensed, right? Because very early on in Chat GPT, we were seeing things like I remember seeing like a very well respected, very experienced lawyer say, yeah, I just used Chat GPT to create an argument for something. And it
Hmm.
basically laid out the exact argument that I would have. Right. There was just one of the co-founders of OpenAI who makes ChatGPT. He did a TED talk. I think it was last week. And he said on there, he talked about a story where someone basically their dog was sick and like they kind of went to the vet, they got some results, but the vet didn't really want to do anything. But they took the information, plugged it into ChatGPT, and figured out what was wrong with the dog. Took it to
Hmm.
another vet with what they had, and basically they were right and were able to save the dog. And he's kind of like citing that as an example, and that's amazing, right? I love that, but also at the same time, we're seeing more and more of those types of results start to get filtered, as it's like, I'm not a lawyer, I cannot give you legal advice. I'm not.
Mm.
You need to take your dog to a vet. And from a liability perspective, like I said, it's obvious in hindsight. From a
Hmm.
liability perspective, I get why they're doing that, but also like that was some of the most valuable information in there. Because let's be honest, not everyone can afford some of these services, right? And so to be able
Mm.
to get an answer, so like I said, from a liability perspective, I get it, but eventually, right, if they keep restricting it like this, it's just going to see a rise in unrestricted models, right? Eventually, like this is going to get filled by someone, right? And this is going to be an interesting thing to see how this plays out as places kind of weigh the potential liability versus basically having a wide open unrestricted model that's going to get people flowing to it. So
Interesting. So actually, in terms of the conversation about the calls for a pause, which there have been lots of calls, actually, you're saying that's not the case, and we should be thinking about it differently because if we place more restrictions, that creates a bit of a vacuum for people with less than
yep.
ideal motivations to come
Yeah,
in.
they absolutely will. It's going to happen, right? Nature abhors a vacuum. It's going to get filled. It's just a matter of who's going to fill it. And so I think and I imagine, right, that OpenAI is struggling with this every single day just to single them out because they are the biggest players in the space, right? But I
Mm.
imagine everyone is struggling with this, so the leaving it unopened, exposing themselves to liability versus, you know, if you shut it down, people are just going to go elsewhere, frankly. So
Absolutely. And I presume you've introduced more elements of this within your course and within the trainings you give.
constantly, constantly now. Yeah, it's pretty much every day now. You're just kind of talking about something. It's like I said, OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, they have something. I've written a blog post on it, two of them actually, technically called a Whisper, and it's this engine where basically you can give it audio or video, and it will transcribe everything that's being said into a text file.
Hmm.
And it can also even translate, and it deals with a bunch of different languages. I am not yesterday, but the day before yesterday, I was talking with a buddy of mine on something else, and a lot of his family is from Eastern Europe. And he said his dad and his grandpa, he was testing it with this really, really obscure dialect from like basically a particular mountain range and kind of like the Uzbek, like kind of that, region. And he said it was just absolutely crushing it. He said he was amazed at how good it was doing of taking this verbal to actually text and kind of getting the text and being able to translate it. And that capability is available offline.
Mm.
Right. And so all of a sudden you think about like from, a law enforcement perspective, interviews, right? You sit there and do like a 1 hour interview with someone, a 3 hour interview with someone, or a debriefing. And now, you maybe tape record it, but now you got to go actually type that up. No, you don't.
Mm.
Right. And before some of the services, like there was Amazon had their transcribe engine out there, which was great, but you had to then basically make the data exposed to Amazon. But now being
Hmm.
able to have some of this capability available offline, right? And that's, like I said, that's another thing that I love where this trend is going is how a lot of it's heading offline because, even Google, there are certain things that are too sensitive to Google, right? There are certain words that I would never type into a Google search bar together for a few
Interesting.
different reasons we won't get into here. But all of a sudden, if I can get some of this capability offline, to where I don't have as much of the OPSEC concern, like that's huge.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So another opportunity. Now, this is progressing so quickly. I think we're just going to have you come back on the show in a few months' time so we can do another update. But
I tell
unfortunately,
you, yeah.
sorry, go for it.
No, I was kind of laughing. I think at least once a week, usually like two or maybe even three, but I'll watch a YouTube video at night, like a couple of YouTube videos. And I'm just kind of chilling on the couch with my wife just to catch up on the changes in like the space,
Mm, mm.
just the changes in the AI/ML. It's constant. It is. So please continue.
Well, I've seen you started to post your own updates and your own takes on the progress on that. So for anyone listening, how can they follow you?
It's I'm pretty easy to find. Matt0177 on Twitter is probably the best place. That's probably where I'm most active. And then I'm on LinkedIn as well too. So now I'm wide open on both places. And yeah, no, it's more and more of how I'm because like I said, I think a lot of people in OSINT, I did a webinar on this topic about 6 weeks ago. And I think I saw some people saying before this, like, oh yeah, chat GPT is cool, but like I would never use it in OSINT. And I'm like, man, I use this every single day and like a variety of different ways. It's not just one particular way that I use it.
Mm-hmm.
And so just kind of exposing that to people. And so it makes them think like, oh wow, yeah, that actually would be really useful.
Amazing, amazing. And so what we'd like to conclude with is, if you could tell us some of the, or not, or just one, something you're seeing good, something you're seeing bad, and something you're seeing fake on the internet today.
Sometimes I'm seeing good, sometimes I'm seeing bad, sometimes I'm seeing fake. Well, in this space, right, I think the good is all over the place. It really, really, truly is. Like I said, people getting answers to topics. I recently a buddy of mine that's still with the government told me that they did like I think it was a 90-minute call with the retirement benefits people, and they had over 400 questions asked. They answered, I believe it was 3 of the questions, and then like, okay, thank you all for showing up, like leaving the other 397 questions unanswered. And I just think of like, how amazing is it going to be to take this capability and train it on like basically local or private data sets,
Mm,
like our health benefits, our retirement benefits, on all of that, to where people can plain text ask a question and get back a fairly authoritative answer.
mm,
And so, like I said, the good, I think, is all over the place, how this is going to change things. The bad, I think we're going to see scams kind of just in so much more almost an automated manner, right? This is going to help things scale, both good and bad, right? It's a SEO, search engine optimization. I remember years ago, like people paying people in like other parts of the world, like very just a couple of dollars to write like, oh, give me a 800-word article on this topic and a 1,200-word article on this topic. Just no one's reading these, right, and thinking, oh, that's really good. They're just basically trying to game the search engine, right? Look, I have
mm,
more blog posts on this because I'm paying someone else to write them. That industry is completely dead now because ChatGPT can do that, right?
mm,
But you're thinking like, okay, if I can get this thing that I used to have to outsource before, and now I can get that push button, people are going to do that with scams too, right? When you have these computer generated voices that are sounding more and more real, or being able to take audio and kind of transcribe what's going on. So unfortunately, I think we are going to see a lot more bad kind of automated at scale, or just easier to spin up. And that's an unfortunately like just kind of a negative thing. And I think that kind of goes into the bad, and I think that kind of goes into the ugly as well too, right? Is just any time where this space is this dynamic, I'm honestly shocked we haven't seen more scams in this space. But
mhm.
it's only a matter of time, right? We've seen a
Yeah.
few type of things. People have tried to basically come up and get funding like they have some new amazing like large language model, when it turns out all they're doing is basically just putting a wrapper around chat gpt and using that as the API. So we have seen some scams in the space, but they're coming fast and furious, right? The more and more people use this, the more and more people are going to get scammed and try to take advantage of it as well too. So no, it's a like I said, it was at the beginning of this year. I never in a million years thought that this would end up becoming like a thing that I would end up kind of focusing on this year, but it seems almost like inevitable at this point.
Amazing, amazing. For anyone who's interested in hearing more about Matt, you follow him on all the channels that he mentioned. Matt, it was so good to have you on the show. Really appreciate your
I don't
time.
know. Anytime, Rafi. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It was nice talking to you.
Really, really great to have you on the show. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.